But again, I want to say, coming out of the break, thank you to Stephen Greetham for his presentation. And now I would like to introduce Admiral Kevin Meeks, MPH, the Deputy Secretary of the Chickasaw Nation Department of Health. So our second presentation is entitled Charting the Course, Exploring the Interplay of Health Boards, Tribal Epidemiology Centers, and Sovereign Tribal Governments in Indigenous Health Governance. You can find Admiral Meeks' full bio in our meeting packet and via the file transfer portal site provided in the email logistics. Without further ado, I am honored to introduce Admiral Meeks. Admiral, you have the floor.
Thank you, Deputy Chief. Chukma, Chehosaphoit, Kevin Meeks, Deputy Secretary of Health, Chickasaw Nation. It is good to be here. Thank you to the TAC for inviting me here. Thank you to CDC for hosting this meeting. Some very important topics are being discussed, and it is my honor and privilege to be here. First thing I'd like to say is forget this title. It has a little bit to do with what I'm going to talk about, but my talk has deviated just since this morning. As I was working through preparing this presentation over the last few weeks, I kind of changed course 5 or 6 times, and I've changed twice since I got here this morning. So we're still gonna try to get through it. Second thing I'll say is I kind of feel like the 5th string left fielder following the all-star shortstop here to my left. I can promise you I will not be as eloquent as Stephen Greetham and not as knowledgeable, but I will tell you what I think I know, and I'll ad-lib the rest. So should be no surprise where I'm going to talk about some relationships and some history as well. It's all tied back to sovereignty. And this is a layman's definition of sovereignty. We heard the legal definition and some great explanations of sovereignty from Stephen's outstanding presentation. But sovereignty is inherent in the society that has that sovereignty. We can say it a lot of different complicated ways, but that pretty much sums it up for me. We found this in a book called American Indian Tribal Governance. And you can look up all kinds of definition, but we didn't earn that sovereignty as Chickasaw Nation or as other tribes. We were not given that sovereignty. We've had that sovereignty since we have been here, and we've never let it go. We're going to talk about some attempts here in just a minute to take that from us, and Mr. Greetham mentioned some of those, but we'll talk about a few going forward. You know, this particular slide, violations of tribal sovereignty, could be attacks on tribal sovereignty, could be ways to get rid of tribes, and these are just a few. Deputy Chief mentioned every tribe has its story, and every group within tribes has their story, and each individual tribal member, tribal citizen, has their story as well. I'm going to tell you a little bit of my story as it relates to these. It's a Chickasaw perspective. I'm a Chickasaw citizen, not necessarily here representing the Chickasaw Nation, but I'm representing myself, my 32 years of experience with the Indian Health Service and working with tribes, and now with my 3 years of working with my tribe, Chickasaw Nation. But starting with those succession treaties, as far as I could tell, Mr. Greetham may be able to correct me, but every treaty entered into by the Chickasaw Nation, with the exception of one, resulted in them losing land, having less land than before. The exception to that is when we finally made the move to what is now Oklahoma. We settled with the Choctaw Nation, and so we actually gained land, and later we divided that land up. We had to purchase our own reservation in Oklahoma at that time, but that's the only one that I could find where we actually gained instead of lost. I don't know, I'll just tell you my perspective. I think that's a pretty sad commentary on the whole idea of treaties, the whole idea of Indian relations with the federal government. We've already heard about the Indian Removal Act, which was passed in 1830. Stephen mentioned a lot of what I'm going to talk about, and other people throughout the morning, but that's okay. We're not trying to beat people over the head with these thoughts and with these ideas, but we do want to impress the importance of this history, the importance of different perspectives about the same history. That Indian Removal Act was passed after the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia had no right to try to rule over First American tribes. In this case, it was the Cherokee Nation. And Andrew Jackson is credited with that famous quote. They made their ruling, let them try to come enforce it. There's a book, if you haven't read it, if you are interested in this period of time, it's called Unworthy Republic. It is an incredible expose over the corruptness, the lying, the double dealing, and the immense amount of money that was made by individuals, institutions, and banks during that time with that land that changed hands, how it was magnified, dollars for pennies. It is a very honest, forthright accounting of that period. And if you are interested, I really encourage you to read that book. You know, Chickasaw Nation was one of the first tribes to sign the treaty that resulted in the removal. That treaty was taken back a year or two later when Chickasaws determined that there was no land suitable that they were going for. That was a provision within that first treaty. They renegotiated another subsequent treaty and then finally started their moving process to what is now Oklahoma about 1837, 1838. Other tribes had gone before and one or two tribes were moved afterwards. But that whole thing was about that southeastern part of the United States that you saw in the earlier presentation with that immense swath of land, Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and the states and the settlers thereof wanted that land to increase monetary profits, and they didn't care who wanted to be there. Andrew Jackson almost ran part of his presidency on removing tribes from that part of the United States. There are a few people that try to make Andrew Jackson's preference for that out to be a hero, that he was trying to protect the tribes, that he knew if that they would have stayed there, we would have stayed there under state control, that the tribal system as we know it would have went away and pretty soon there would be no more First Americans. They're in the distinct minority. I think if you read your history books and you look at that time, you'll see that Andrew Jackson had no love for Native Americans and could care less whether they were able to make it into the future or not. And as far as he was concerned, banishing them, my term, not anybody else's, to Oklahoma was a way to get rid of the tribal problem, not to protect them in any sense of the word. During the removal of Chickasaw Nation, we paid for our own removal. Other tribes had different types of assistance, but the Chickasaw Nation actually paid for their removal out of the profits or return, I guess, on the sale of their land, on the sale of their animals and their equipment and things like that. There was an immense loss of life, probably proportionally not as much as some other tribes who were force marched during bad times of year during that time. There were drownings, people died from disease, people died from starvation, and yet the force marches continued. When the Chickasaws got there, the U.S. government tried to make us become part of the Choctaw Nation. We were settled in the western part of the Choctaw Nation in the southern third of what is now Oklahoma. We got, I think if memory serves me, one representative on the Choctaw Council to voice Chickasaw concerns. Well, guess who won those votes if there were differences in opinion about what was good for those two tribes? Eventually, Chickasaws petitioned the U.S. government and received that treaty that allowed us to operate as our own government and get our own lands. But once again, we had to pay for that land. That land was not given to us. We had to pay the Choctaw Nation for the western 2/3 of that southern third of what is now Oklahoma. There are many more things that happened in the late 1800s that some would view as a means to extinguish tribes and get rid of the Indian problem, but we can just skip ahead and move up to statehood. Oklahoma became a state in November of 1907, and the reservations as we knew them went away, or at least we thought we went away. There's been some decisions in the last few years that changed that perspective in a great deal. But when Oklahoma became a state, our tribal governments went away, our tribal lands went away, and it was a sad time. In fact, we were not allowed to, I think this applied to all 5 of the civilized tribes. We were not allowed to elect our own tribal leader. The president appointed tribal leaders 2 years at a time, and that's what they did from 1907 up until the early 1970s, when we were finally allowed by the federal government to elect our tribal leader. Everybody, well, I'm assuming that everybody, certainly most of us, have heard of the boarding school period. And as we heard just a minute ago, it didn't end in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It extended on through the 70s and the 80s. And people are suffering that. We're not talking ancient history. Most of us who are citizens of our tribes know people who went through this, and we understand that many of them underwent horrors that we will not talk about here while they were at those boarding schools. My grandmother was sent to a boarding school against her will, against her parents' will, when she was 7 years old. That school, Bloomfield Academy, burned a few years later, and she didn't have to go back. But she would tell us stories of not being able to speak their language, and a lot of other things a lot worse than that. And that my grandmother, and you'll see her picture in just a few minutes, she was my direct connection to my tribal heritage, to my tribal lineage. And she was, we'll talk about her in just a little bit. Oh yeah, on the slide is called the assimilation effort. It was a relocation effort where Indian individuals and families would be gathered up, and they would be sent to large metropolitan areas, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera, because the government believed that, well, if you can't make a living in southern Oklahoma, or if you can't make a living in southwestern South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation, we'll send you to a big place that has lots of jobs and lots of opportunities. And sure enough, some tribal members succeeded in that environment, but others were just lost by the wayside. And we can't account, we don't know what happened. They were not able to adjust to that life. It's very similar. It's an adult version of the childhood version of the boarding school era. Sent them where they had no connections. They had no connection to the ground. They had no connection to the people. It was a terrible time. And all of these things, I'm convinced, well, I won't say it that way. I'll say a lot of these things may have been conceived thinking that it was a good idea for individual tribal citizens as well as tribes to grow a little bit. But the result was it was always trying to make the tribes themselves less powerful, to have less influence, and to eventually go away. There are countless other stories that we can tell from the beginning of this country till now, with the broken treaties, the broken promises. And I'm not trying to make y'all feel bad for tribes. I'm not trying to make you feel bad as individuals. I'm just painting the picture here that that's what we came against. Governor Anatubby told Governor Anatubby is governor of the Chickasaw Nation. He told a very moving story back at a leadership meeting right before Christmas. And the Chickasaw Nation is not supposed to be here. And he went through step by step on attempts to do away with the Chickasaw Nation over and over and over. And yet we are still here. It was not only moving to those of us who were able to hear that, it was moving to Governor Anatubby himself. When he talked about the trials and tribulations, yet we are still here. It is not that far away. These are the people I come from. It's my great-grandmother, uncle. Bottom right is my mom. Up in the upper left is mom with her sister and brother-in-law, Grandpa and Granny Parker. Granny Parker standing off on the right with one of my cousins there sitting on Grandpa's lap. Granny Parker experienced a lot of what we just went through. Like I said, she went to boarding school. She was born in Indian Territory before Oklahoma became a state. She was a direct benefactor as well as victim of the Dawes Act and the enrollment and the land allotments. Where they, you know, in her case, in her family's case, those land allotments were scattered throughout the Chickasaw. They were not together, so the family would stay together. Her allotment was up by Aloso, Oklahoma. Her mother's was somewhere else. One of her siblings was way down at Ardmore, Oklahoma, in southern Oklahoma. And it was meant to break the family up and to disintegrate that structure that kept the tribe strong. But she overcame, as did the rest of Chickasaw Nation, Choctaw Nation, Cherokee, Seminoles Creeks, and the other tribes that are in Oklahoma. Some more pictures. If you hear a little emotion in my voice from time to time, and when you're talking to tribal members and tribal citizens about anything related to their tribe and their tribe's history, you may detect sometimes passion, sometimes anger, sometimes frustration, emotion of some sort. It's because this is very personal to us. And it is not ancient history. It's today's history. And these, when we operate our hospital, when we operate our health system, we're doing that for our grandparents and our aunts and our uncles, our cousins, our parents, our brothers and sisters, our kids, our grandkids, and those that will come after them. And so we're trying to do the best we absolutely can do to carry that tradition forward and not carry that past with us in a bad way, but to recognize where we came from and what our ancestors went through. I was talking to our medical staff leadership a month or two ago at a medical staff leadership retreat in Oklahoma City, and was telling a longer story of the Chickasaw Nation, going back to when Chickasaw Nation became Chickasaw Nation and settled in what is now northern Mississippi. And I tried to impress on them, and I'll try to impress everybody here, that we are the people that my ancestors prayed for, that would help our citizens and our tribes flourish in today's environment. And everyone in this room has a piece of that prayer. Some of us are working directly for the tribe, working in that health system, or working in public health, or serving as a tribal leader. Others of you, and I'm talking to our CDC colleagues and counterparts, you are directly and indirectly helping the tribe fulfill its destiny. And you and we are the people that my ancestors prayed for as they came across the Trail of Tears, as they established themselves in Oklahoma, as they saw their lands further taken away after the Civil War in Oklahoma. As they went to those boarding schools, they endured so we could be here. So when we talk about tribes and the business of being a tribal government and offering those services to our citizens, we want you to understand why we are so passionate about what we have accomplished and what we're going to accomplish in the future. And we want you to know that while we're going to do everything we can to do it ourselves, we embrace partnership with our federal partners. We could not have accomplished what we've accomplished so far without a very close and unique relationship with the Indian Health Service. We could not have accomplished a lot of what we've accomplished as a nation without a close relationship with the Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs. And we want the same kind of relationship with CDC and everybody else that the tribe partners with for the benefit of our tribal members and our tribal citizens. Picture in the upper left is my great-grandmother. That's my grandmother in the top center. She has a unique name. It's named Bijima. Not a Chickasaw name. Nobody knows where it came from. Some people called her Jim. My grandpa called her Jim. Some people called her Biji. Some people tried to pronounce Bijimi, and they usually fell all over themselves. And most people just called her Granny Parker and got away with it. So she was a wonderful church-going Christian lady that loved her family. And she was my connection to my tribe's past. And what little I know about our tribes and men's history, much of it came from Granny Parker. The upper right and lower left is my mother, who is still alive. She just lives about 150 yards from us. And she's a very proud Chickasaw citizen as well. And so I wanted to give you a picture of the past, where we came from, but there's the future down below. So there's my daughter, one of my daughters, and one of my granddaughters. And that's who we do all this for. It's real people making up, in my case, the Chickasaw Nation, in your case, Cherokee Nation, Muskogee Nation, and on and on and on. And the tribes that are represented here on this TAC, they have similar stories, not the same, but they have their story, and they have the reason that they are fighting for what they believe is right for their people, for their tribe, and for their nations. And we are inviting our CDC colleagues and counterparts to help us accomplish what we need to accomplish to help our nations flourish. That's enough about Kevin. So one reason I've slipped into this rest of this presentation, there were some commonalities with public health authority, and we're here with CDC, and we're here about public health authority, especially just coming out of COVID and all the things that were associated with that. And you can read that big, long definition. And what is it for? It's really about protecting the public health. It's an agency of the United States government, a state, a territory. It finally gets to tribes that's responsible for public health matters. Some people think we can't be responsible for public health matters. The state of Texas refused to recognize tribal sovereignty during COVID and did not participate with the tribes there within the state's borders. There are other governors across the country that refuse to recognize tribes or tribal TECs and other groups as having any kind of public health authority, and hindered the efforts to respond to that public health crisis that we know is the COVID pandemic. But we're going to talk a little bit about public health authority as it applies to the federal government, particularly IHS, since that's where I came from. I don't know if you've read that boring thing that we call Kevin's bio, but I did 32 years as a commissioned officer working for Indian Health Service all across the country. I would not trade for that time and the experiences that I've had. But that's where some of this is going to come from. So most of you know this, where does public health authority come from? A lot of times we think it comes from a statute or an act of Congress. That is where the TEC's public health authority came from. A regulation, which is not a federal law, by the way. A lot of people confuse regulation with a statute. Regulation is not a federal law. Regulation is a rule that's promulgated by an agency. It has legal force, but it is not federal law. And in spite of what agencies may tell us from time to time, those regulations are a whole lot easier to change than it is to get a new federal law passed through Congress. It's just a lack of willingness to change that regulation. And then there's an executive order and the authority that comes directly from the president. So with the Indian Health Service, which is what who we'll pick on now. Is anybody from IHS here? Nobody will admit it. I was only one guy, so that's David. I had to embarrass David, and I wanted to congratulate the captain on his new appointment and he coming to CDC. And we're excited for you to have this new position. We know you're going to do well, and we want to make you a success. But if you're a success, we think we're going to be a success too. But IHS is the primary federal agency tasked with the responsibility to provide health care to American Indians, Alaska Natives, or First Americans. A lot of people, particularly those in Congress and OMB, want to blame the Indian Health Service for every ill that has affected every American Indian living in the last 50 years. Well, IHS didn't come into being until 1955, so I'm not sure that is a fair assessment. But one thing that we need to remember, and one thing I want my CDC colleagues to hear, that the treaties that the tribes made with the federal government, or vice versa, were not limited to what is now Indian Health Service and what is now the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Those treaties were between those tribes and the United States government, and the whole force of the U.S. government is supposed to be available to live up to those treaty obligations. But too often we find out that that's not the case. It's IHS's fault of the condition of some of our reservations in the Northern Plains and the Northwest and the Southwest and the Southeast. But where are those other federal agencies that should be there to help with transportation issues, to help with school issues, to help with jobs issues, and so on and so on, and those social determinants of health that when it comes to tribes are often so easily swept aside and just said, well, that's the way it is. It's been that way for 100 years. But it doesn't have to be that way forever. And with a little assistance from the right agencies within the federal government, those tribes will be able to rise up themselves and accomplish great things, but it's going to take everybody working together. They've been put in a bad place. They've had things taken away. We have had things taken away, and it's going to take everybody to bring those things back. IHS typically delegates public health data requests to TECs, interestingly enough. And when you look at the, I found it interesting, when you look at the, it's not an application, it's a proposal to request data from Indian Health Service. No place on that form is there a box for tribal concurrence or tribal approval or tribal agreement. It's between the TEC most often and IHS, and tribes are left completely out of the picture. Unless there is a unique special relationship between TECs and the tribes, and some, to be frank, sometimes there is, sometimes there's not. IHS has some public health authority within that agency. They operate public health departments for those remaining direct service locations. And they do a lot of public health work in response to public health emergencies. And their public health authority comes from their position as an agency within the federal government and within the laws that established IHS. Then we move along to Tribal Epidemiology Centers, or TECs. And we all know about ICHIA, right? The Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. It had been strung along, and every few years would have to be reauthorized and reauthorized. This is kind of a bad choice of words with this slide. It wasn't really a reauthorization in 2010. It was when ICHIA was made permanent as part of the Affordable Care Act. They acknowledged tribal epidemiology centers as public health authorities, but their public health authority was limited to data and being able to meet the qualifications of HIPAA without going through as business associates and all of that kind of stuff that HIPAA law requires up with a lot of that data exchange. So they have public health authority, and that is given to them, awarded to them by federal law. Continue with tribal epidemiology centers. That there's the overarching thing with ICHIA. Congress declares it is the policy of this nation in fulfillment of its special trust responsibilities, and we've heard a lot of people mention that special trust responsibility and legal obligation to Indians to ensure the highest possible health status for Indians and urban Indians, to provide all necessary resources to affect that policy. And I could take off on this and use the remainder of my time to talk about that highest possible health status for Indians. And I'll just, I'll probably move on to I will move on to the next slide after I say one thing. If that's the case, put your money where your mouth is, government, because IHS and tribal health programs are funded at about 50% of what the level of need is. Federal prisoners in the Bureau of Prison System get more per capita funding, almost twice as much as the first Americans do on a per capita basis. Federal prisoners are not served under a federal trust responsibility. Continue with tribal epidemiology centers, that their public health authority is limited to deal with HIPAA. That health information is transferred to them to do the research that they want to do. Continuing with TECs, the law directs Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services to grant TECs access to data. And that is in several citations that I saw, and that comes right out of the law, right? The secretary can provide data to those TECs. But who do the TECs work with, for, and whose authority do they use? They have their own public health authority, but they are supposed to be working locally within tribal jurisdictions to get that data and perform those studies and conduct that research, if you will, for those tribes that they serve in their particular area. If you remember, the law originally established one tribal epidemiology center to be placed in each area. So those centers were established, I think we're coming up on 26, 27 years of the establishment of TECs, and they have done a good job. I'm not here to beat up TECs any more than I'm here to beat up anybody else. TECs have done a good job with the resources provided to them, and they stood up, they provide a valuable service. But we're going to talk how to leverage those efforts with the tribes and try to make more than they could have accomplished by themselves. You see what those 7 core functions: evaluating data and programs, identifying health priorities, making recommendations for health service needs, making recommendations for improving healthcare delivery systems, providing technical assistance, providing disease surveillance. How do they decide which one to work on? And how do they decide what to work on within those? Could ask the same question as CDC when you're looking at these epidemiology concepts here. How do you decide what to work on behalf of Indian country? How does CDC decide what to work on behalf of the tribes within the Oklahoma City area or the AIDA service unit, the home of the Chickasaw Nation? We're gonna look at things just a little bit left-handed here in just a second. So the secretary, we believe, has the authority to provide requested data to TECs, right? That's quoted a lot. And TECs have the authority to request that data and to conduct that research or those studies. But what I discovered in preparing for this presentation, a thing that I have never paid attention to before. And before all of that authority for TECs to do their thing and for the secretary to provide his thing, there's a little clause in consultation with and on the request of Indian tribes, tribal organizations and urban tribal organizations. Each TEC established under their section shall, and then it moves into those 7 functions. It all starts with the tribe and the tribe's needs, requesting, at a minimum, agreeing to what data is going to be provided to them. I believe, I'm not an attorney and I'm sitting by one, and hopefully he doesn't slap me if I speak out of place, but I believe that even applies to the secretary and his release of that data, because this comes first in the law and everything else falls underneath it, but nobody looks at it like that. TECs request data all the time and never get permission from tribes. They are doing it because they believe that that is the best, what they should be doing. The secretary provides data without consulting with the tribes. But I think in 1621, in consultation with and on the request of Indian tribes, takes precedent of any data request and any supplying of that data to that requester. And this all goes back to the sovereignty discussion. That's where all this falls to. It's the tribes should be taking the lead, not the federal government and not the TECs. When tribes, and we'll have a slide in just a minute about Public Law 93-638 or the ability of a tribe to contract or compact with the U.S. government to provide the services that before were provided by the federal government. Why was that authority given to them? Why was that ability to contract or compact with the government to provide health service given to the tribes in the first place? Because tribes know best what their people need. and it's to make local decisions at the local level to benefit the local population. No more one size fits all with decisions made in the Ivory Tower or Washington, D.C. or Bethesda, Maryland for all of Indian country at one time, because the needs of the Chickasaw Nation are different, can be different than that of the Cherokee Nation, which can be different from that of the Blackfoot tribe, which can be different from those tribes up in Alaska. And it's up to the tribes to determine what those priorities are so that they can best serve their people. We talk about consultation. Everybody's got a different version of consultation. There's the official version of consultation, the legal definition of what constitutes tribal consultation and how can we accomplish that and document that. And I would argue probably wouldn't need consultation if we just have communication. And real communication, where each side listens to the other and tries to understand the other's perspective in order to do the right thing. But because we have trouble doing that, we have consultation, and it's a big thing. It is a big thing to have tribal consultation, especially if you want to have tribal consultation with 560-something tribes at once. It's a big thing just to have tribal consultation with all the tribes in the state of Oklahoma or the Oklahoma City area. It's almost just a big thing to have a tribal consultation with just one tribe. But when our federal partners are working on an issue that's going to affect a group of tribes, those tribes that are going to be affected should be consulted with, should be communicated with, so you can get that local input, that local perspective to include in that federal decision. Tribes want to take care of themselves, their own people. Sometimes it is the federal interpretation of law and regulations and policy that prevents tribes from doing that. We want out from under that in many cases. Those tribes who choose to remain under federal control, that is their right to choose that. And they should be treated with just as much respect as the tribes who choose to run their own health system. It's all about sovereignty, the respect of and the understanding for tribal sovereignty, the position that those tribal leaders are in. Somebody, I think it was you, Stephen, talked about how much tribal leaders are involved in. Small tribe, big tribe, medium tribe, it doesn't matter. They are involved in every aspect of that tribal operation, and frankly, I don't know how they do it. There's a lot that they have to take care of. They want to do it in partner with us. They want to do it in partnership with the federal government, but they want it in the best interest of their people. So now we have tribes and public health authority with the tribes. So it would stand to reason, right, that if a tribe can assume operation of a health system from the federal government, which includes public health, that the tribes would automatically have public health authority. I may have missed it, but I looked in every Indian law that I could find, and nowhere did I find a federal law that says tribes have public health authority. But I believe it is inherent in the sovereignty that those tribes possess, especially when they are running their own health programs that they have assumed from the federal government, that public health authority comes with them. It comes with that responsibility. I used to get in trouble when I was area director for IHS. My legal counsel down in Dallas I would look and say, well, this law doesn't say I can't do X. That's not enough. Federal law is permissive law. Unless it says you can do it, you can't do it. So I wonder how many of our federal partners, not necessarily in this room, but of all the agencies, if it doesn't say that tribes are public health authorities, does that mean that we're not going to treat tribes like public health authorities? They have to have that authority if they operate their health system. They have to have that authority if they are the sovereign nations that we say they are. But the law doesn't give us that nomenclature. It doesn't give us that title. But I would hope that CDC, IHS, BIA in some cases, and other federal agencies would look at tribes, especially those tribes running their own health system, that they do have that public health authority. And they have that ability to manage those public health emergencies and respond to those public health emergencies in their area. We talked about Governor Nome in South Dakota and getting mad at the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe for wanting to shut down the highway. You know, Navajo Nation shut down some major highways during COVID to protect their people. That tribe that inhabits the Grand Canyon shut off access to that reservation to protect their people so they weren't exposed to COVID. And those were public health actions taken by tribal leadership in the best interests of those tribes and of those people. That's the public health authority that we have to have. We talked about COVID response. In Oklahoma, the state system and the county system fell apart during COVID. And if it was not for the tribes, the hit on Oklahoma citizens, including tribal citizens, I hate to imagine what that would have been. The Chickasaw Nation itself vaccinated people from over 38 states because they couldn't get their vaccination in their home state. We had people flying into Oklahoma City, driving to Chickasaw Nation because they couldn't get vaccinations in their own state. We opened up vaccinations to everybody, regardless of whether they were a tribal Indian beneficiary or not and eligible for Indian health services. We opened up our hospital because the state and county hospitals were overflowing with intensive care patients who couldn't breathe because of COVID. And we opened it up to what our non-beneficiaries or non-Indians in order to protect all of the state and not just our local people. We were the partners. We led the effort. I know that our fellow tribes in Oklahoma, they took care of their region of the state when the counties couldn't do it. I can't understand why we would not formally be given the name Public Health Authority to manage our public health affairs. I would argue that we do, and I would ask that we be treated like we do in every case, big and small. Just kind of stating what I said, Public Health Authority was not explicitly listed anywhere I could find in the Federal Register. So ICHIA talks about the unique needs and priorities of tribal communities. And once again, it's really another way of talking about sovereignty and the authority and responsibility of tribal governments to take care of their own people. And I hate to keep repeating it over and over and over, but with different ways of saying the same thing, my hope is that it will make an impact on the way that our government partners make decisions in the future, and that there will be a bigger appreciation of what sovereignty really is, and maybe understand just a little bit better of what our tribes are trying to accomplish and why. Tribes have inherent authority as sovereign nations to protect and promote the health and welfare of our people. That's what public health authority is all about. We're not trying to exclude people. We're trying to protect people. And I can promise you, if we protect our people as Chickasaws, as Cherokees, as Muskogee, as Choctaws, as Seminoles, and other tribes, it's going to spill over and it's going to protect our non-tribal citizens as well. Governor Anatubby says over and over, a rising tide lifts all boats. And when Chickasaw Nation is a success, Pontotoc County is a success. And when Pontotoc County is a success, South Central Oklahoma is a success. And it just breeds success wherever it touches. We talked about Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. And I will tell my federal colleagues, when I transferred back to Oklahoma City from Alaska in 1995, that was in the beginnings and the heyday of self-governance. And the federal programs, the federal government, frankly, we were offended that the tribes thought they could do a better job than us. And we resisted that. And we were scared of that. We were fighting for our jobs, if you want to know the truth. And so there were lots of discussions that were very spirited during that time. And it took us a time frame of about 6 or 7 years to finally understand what we're trying to communicate today about sovereignty and the responsibilities of those tribal governments, whether tribes choose to compact or contract, or whether those tribes want to stay with the federal delivery of healthcare. That is tribal self-determination. That is the tribe's right to decide. And it wasn't up for us to decide if a tribe could do it or not. It was their right to decide. So when it comes time to enter in those discussions with tribes, don't be offended that they are coming for you or coming for your job. That's not what it's about. That is just that tribal leader and that tribe, that tribal government, their expression of wanting to take care of their own, to do the right thing. We talked about government to government relations. I hope and I pray that we all understand what that means. And maybe, especially with Stephen's presentation and the discussions this morning, that government to government and tribal sovereignty maybe have taken on a little bit bigger, clearer meaning for those of us who engage in those discussions. Those are not just words. And anybody can just say those words. They're, we call them buzzwords if we want to, but the meaning behind them is deep. And when we look at those pictures of my people from yesterday, from 50 years ago, from 75 years ago, that's why those words are there. Those words are connected to those people and what those people went through so that we could have the life that we're having today. More government to government relations. So where did this take us? I am not trying to beat up TEC, not trying to beat up CDC, not trying to beat up IHS, but I want us to look at things in a new light and figure out how we can move forward to do bigger and better things for the benefit of tribal citizens. That last bullet is the point I wanted to get to. It's a new paradigm of tribes first, allowing tribes to lead with tribal initiatives, tribal perspectives, tribal priorities, instead of tribes responding to somebody else deciding what those priorities are. And if that's not sovereignty or an example of sovereignty, I'm not sure what is. Tribes should be taking the lead. And now I turn the tables to my tribal partners here at this table, and that puts a big responsibility on us and you as the de facto tribal leaders in the TAC of being able and willing to effectively communicate what those priorities are. Your perspective is invaluable, and your federal partners need to hear that from you loud and clear and on a regular basis so that they can work with you to identify those. Because if we don't speak as the tribes, then the federal government's going to do what the federal government does based on what they think is best. Not because they're jerks, just because they're tasked with doing something. And for our federal partners, I'll know that sometimes you're in a bind because what Congress may tell the CDC you're going to do, what CDC leadership may tell you what you're going to do is in direct conflict with your relationship with tribe. I get that. I hope my tribal partners get that. You got to, sometimes it hurts and sometimes there are consequences, and they're not necessarily just consequences. But I would just ask you to do what's right on behalf of our government's responsibility to tribes, and to do what's right no matter what the cost. And eventually it's going to go throughout the entire organization, and the government is going to start treating tribes the way tribes should have been treated all along so that tribes can grow and prosper. We've got a few more slides I'm going to skip through because I've talked a lot longer than what I thought I was going to talk, but we just want to partner for the benefit of tribal nations. And I hope with what Stephen has said, Deputy Chief and Second Chief have said, has given you a perspective on tribal sovereignty and tribal partnership that maybe you didn't have before. We appreciate everything you do. We look forward to continued collaboration with you as we grow, as we work with each other to further Indian health and our tribal governments across the country. So I will stop now and be quiet. I could go on for a long time. It's hard to encapsulate this in a 45 to 50-minute presentation. Hope you'll forgive me for rambling around, but thank you for your attention. I appreciate all of you, and thank you for what you do.
Well, no, Admiral Meeks. Thank you, sir, for delivering that great presentation. And I want to open the floor to a larger group of the TAC or CDC officials. if anybody has any comments, obviously we can continue to talk about this for quite some time. So anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, thank you both again. Everybody, one more round of applause. Okie dokie. Well, we right now we'll take a break until 3 o'clock. They want everybody back in this room at 3 o'clock because at 3 we're going to depart as a group for the Emergency Operations Center, where our escorts will kind of divide us up into whatever lab that you're going to go to. I don't know about y'all, but I'm excited. But before I go to that, I want to turn the floor to Captain Killsback for some information.
Thank you. I know earlier was a talk about forming a subcommittee. I just want to make sure that we reaffirm the language in the charter about how subcommittees are formed, with the TAC chair and the co-chair in consultation with our designated federal official, Dr. Dauphin, may form subcommittees comprised of TAC delegates or their alternates as needed to accomplish the functions of the TAC. To satisfy the UMRA exemption, the members of the subcommittee must be either a elected tribal leader acting in official capacities, or designated employees of an elected tribal leaders with authority to act on their behalf, or a representative of a national association designated by tribal leaders to act on their behalf. Subcommittees must report directly to the full TAC and must not provide any advice or work products to a federal officer or the CDC ATSDR. The TAC can adopt and present such advice or work to a federal officer or ATSDR. Let's make sure I'm clear about that. That's in the charter. So we know we talked about subcommittee formulation earlier. So I just make sure with that in mind as we move forward to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. So we will break now and then, like I said, yes, sir.
No, I just wanted to thank you, Chief Warner, about the day, for your leadership. There was a lot of good discussions that happened today from, CDC presentations and also the presentations we heard today. And these are important things for us to keep in mind as we're moving forward. And thank you for sharing the history, the background, for us to move forward. It's very important to know where we've been so that we'll be effective in going forward. And Admiral Nick, for your sharing your personal stories and reminding us of the public health authority and how that would help us with the government-to-government relationship. So I just wanted to thank you, Chief Warner, and the presenters also.
Well done, Doctor. Thank you. Thank you. So again, break. Now remember, after the lab, we will come back. We will reconvene here to close out the day and get a summary from Dr. Dauphin. So we are on break back here at 3 o'clock. We're going to go check out some enterics, mycotics, and waterborne diseases causing agents. Yes.